Prime Minister Mark Carney has announced Canada is removing many retaliatory tariffs on the US. The decision is part of a broader effort to ease trade tension and maintain a favourable relationship with the US.
A new conflict has erupted in global trade. And if you think this is just another dispute over taxes, you are deeply mistaken. August 2025, US President Donald Trump announces new tough tariffs on steel, aluminum, pharmaceuticals, and even gold. His goal is to force trading partners to play by American rules. But one neighbor, Canada, decides it's not playing anymore.
Alcohol, shoes and clothing are among the US tariffs, which will no longer face levies when imported to Canada. Mr. Carney believes his country has the best trade deal with America.
Against the backdrop of broken trade chains, factory closures, and rising prices in the US, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney chooses a path that no one expected. He does not engage in open confrontation, but he does not back down either. Instead, he opts for strategic diplomacy, rapid diversification, and careful calculation, where each step is not a gesture of desperation but a demonstration of cool-headed strength.
And more than 85% of Canada-US trade is now tariff-free. Let's be absolutely clear. Canada currently has the best trade deal with the United States.
Why is Canada suddenly softening some of its retaliatory tariffs on American goods, while at the same time strengthening economic cooperation with Europe? Why is the Prime Minister holding meetings in Poland, Germany, and Latvia? And what do Canadian canola and Chinese electric cars have in common?
Throughout our negotiations with the United States on a new trade and security relationship, the objectives of Canada's new government have been constant.
Meanwhile, Trump is launching the most radical trade attack of his second term. Pharmaceuticals, one of the last untouched sectors, is now in the crosshairs. Tariffs of up to 250% are being imposed on imported medicines. The goal is to bring manufacturing back to the US. The consequences are possible increases in drug prices, drug shortages, and global supply disruptions. And, as always, Canada finds itself at the epicenter.
First, to protect Canadian workers and their families. Second, to reinforce the competitiveness of Canadian businesses. And thirdly, to build the strongest economy in the G7.
But that's not all. A 39% tariff on gold bullion imports from Switzerland is a shock to the entire global financial system. Gold? Yes, your investment portfolio, your banking system, your economic forecast, all of this is now under threat. Because, as practice shows, if gold can be subject to tariffs, then tomorrow any key resource could be under attack, from lithium to uranium.
Our negotiations with the United States have been taking place as the U.S. has been in the process of fundamentally transforming all of its trading relationships. This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
And now a blow from the East. China, responding to Canada's sanctions against Chinese steel and electric cars, is responding asymmetrically, with a tariff of almost 76% on Canadian canola. For farmers in Alberta and Saskatchewan, this is not a diplomatic dispute, but a direct threat to their business and survival. What is happening? The world has entered an era of trade strikes without warning. America is no longer holding back. China is acting tough. Europe is looking for alternatives. And Canada, for the first time in decades, Canada is stepping out of the shadow of the US and starting to play its own game. But does it have enough time, allies, and resources to withstand this pressure from both sides?
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
Relations between Canada and the United States in 2025 are going through perhaps the most turbulent period in decades. What was once considered an unshakable partnership, cemented by geography, economics, and political commitments, is rapidly crumbling under the pressure of the White House's tough and sometimes unpredictable trade policy. President Donald Trump, who entered his second term with the slogan "America wins again," has turned tariffs into his main weapon of pressure, not only on geopolitical rivals, but also on his closest allies. And once again, Canada was the first to be hit. It all started with a sharp increase in tariffs on steel, aluminum, and copper up to 50% under the pretext of national security. This move dealt a serious blow to Canadian steelmakers, especially in Ontario and Quebec, where thousands of workers found themselves on the verge of dismissal. Despite the existing USMCA agreement, which was supposed to guarantee free trade between the US, Canada, and Mexico, the Trump administration found a way to circumvent it by activating a clause on temporary measures in the event of a threat. And that was just the beginning.
It's a great question, Matt, and Canada is trying to figure out the answer. One of the things we need to understand about tariffs, however, is that they're not just an economic weapon.
Canada's response could have been mirrored. Powerful counter-tariffs, breaking off negotiations, public confrontation. But Prime Minister Mark Carney made an unexpected move. Instead of direct escalation, he announced the cancellation of some retaliatory tariffs on American goods, including food products and household chemicals. This sparked a wave of criticism within the country. The opposition accused the government of weakness, and trade unions demanded a tough response to Washington. However, Carney acted with cold calculation.
Amazing what's happened. That's also the view on Wall Street, but in a very different way. The president not acknowledging
This move was not a sign of capitulation, but an attempt to demonstrate respect for the USMCA agreement and at the same time to portray the US in the eyes of the international community as the party violating the agreement. In Brussels, where the latest round of Canadian-European trade negotiations was taking place, this strategy made an impression. One senior EU official noted in a private conversation, Carney is not putting on a show like Trump. He is building long-term structures, and we can see that.
Well, I think the devil really is in the detail, because it appears that the Trump administration has actually reached agreements with perhaps only about a dozen countries so far and the EU, and of those agreements, only one.
Within Canada, the consequences were mixed. On the one hand, prices for imported goods did begin to fall. The cost of fruit juices, American cereal boxes, and some clothing decreased. Some Canadian families living below the poverty line felt relief. On the other hand, industrialists, especially steel producers, remained under pressure. Nevertheless, strategically important sectors, metals, and the automotive industry remained protected. Canada retained its own tariffs on them, limiting them to the target impact. This hybrid tactic was aimed not only at economic restraint, but also at political positioning. Carney and his team understood that giving in too early meant playing by someone else's rules, but shooting in all directions meant undermining their own economy. Therefore, Canada adopted a new doctrine: trade stability through diplomatic initiative. From now on, every move Ottawa makes is not a spontaneous attack, but part of a strategy to build multipolar economic relations.
Well, at this point, there's no there are ongoing discussions, but there's no ongoing negotiation.
Meanwhile, the rhetoric in the US was becoming increasingly belligerent. Speaking to voters in Pennsylvania, Trump said, "If Canada wants to play dirty, we have 100% tariffs." Although this statement was not accompanied by immediate action, the signal was clear: the pressure would increase. Behind the scenes at the White House, a package of new restrictions was being discussed, ranging from quotas on Canadian cars to tariffs on pharmaceuticals and timber. Moreover, insiders at the US Department of Commerce hinted that the sphere of national interest protection could be extended to Canadian IT services and cloud storage platforms. In response, Carney initiated an urgent reassessment of the export strategy. An anti-crisis task force was quickly assembled, including representatives from business, industry, and provincial governments. One of the first decisions was to begin a large-scale analysis of the dependence of Canadian industries on American supplies and markets. It turned out that, for example, in mechanical engineering, more than 72% of components are imported from the US, and although most of them are not subject to tariffs, the situation could change at any moment.
Is the president operating on any sort of a timeline or deadline where he wants this completed by? Well, we always move at Trump speed here at the White House, which is incredibly fast. All options are on the table for each country, but again, these are going to be tailor-made deals. They are not going to be off-the-rack deals, as the president has called it.
At the same time, internal preparations began for a possible protracted trade blockade. Several provinces, including Manitoba and Ontario, began negotiations with Asian and European investors on the location of new assembly and logistics centers. Canadian manufacturers began to receive tax breaks for redistributing supply chains within the country. One of the largest contracts signed in July 2025 was an agreement with the German concern Helm Bauer GmbH to supply robotic lines for automobile assembly, which were to replace American components at plants in Windsor. But despite these measures, tensions were mounting. In the summer of 2025, several large car factories in Ontario cut production by 30% due to supply instability. Workers staged protests in Toronto. One of them, holding a sign that read, "We are not pawns in your trade game," told reporters bluntly, "We are not at war with America. We just don't want to be collateral damage." Nevertheless, public opinion gradually began to lean toward Carney. This was especially true after a series of reports about how small businesses in the US were closing down, unable to cope with the price pressure caused by tariffs. One such example is a family-owned toy store in New York that had been in business since 1982. Due to new duties on Chinese and Canadian goods, their purchase prices rose by 40%. The owner, George Martini, closed the business with the words, "We didn't survive not because we didn't fight. It's because Trump thinks war is always a win." Meanwhile, behind the scenes of politics, a second, more covert phase of the conflict was beginning, the battle for tempo. While Trump acted quickly and aggressively, Carney played for time, building alliances and gathering arguments. His logic was simple. Every new step Washington takes alienates not only Canada but also US allies around the world. And if Canada holds out, it will become a symbol that, under pressure, it is not the loudest who survive, but the most resilient.
We would be ready to negotiate after the election, which are basically in less than 3 weeks. At the same time, we want to make sure that we can negotiate not only on trade, but also on security. And we need a full partnership. But at the end of the day, what we know, Jake, is the relationship between Canada and the US will never be the same.
Thus, the first weeks of the trade confrontation in 2025 became more than just an economic clash between two countries. It was a test of maturity, strategic endurance, and willingness to play the long game. Canada did not throw down the gauntlet in response. It launched a diplomatic offensive. And while Trump was raising tariffs, Carney was laying the foundation for a new independence. Against the backdrop of increasing pressure from the US, Canada began not just to defend itself, it transformed its foreign economic strategy. Ottawa's trade policy in 2025 became a mirror image of the new international reality. No one can afford to rely on just one partner anymore, even if that partner is the United States. Realizing this, Mark Carney's government took a step that would have seemed impossible a year ago: full-scale trade diversification with a focus on Europe, Asia, and the global South.
The first deal that was struck, that with the UK, has actually been signed. So there is a lot of details still to be worked out here, Tig, and the devil very much in the detail potentially, because we have still, of course, agreements to be reached with...
One of the main areas of focus was strengthening relations with the European Union. As early as May 2025, Carney personally initiated a series of visits to Germany, Poland, Latvia, and Belgium. The official reason was to expand defense cooperation within the framework of NATO operations. But behind the scenes, there were intense negotiations on strategic supplies of Canadian energy resources, lithium, nickel, and other critical minerals. For Europe, still recovering from the effects of the 2022 to 2023 energy shock, Canada became an unexpected but welcome partner. German Industry Minister Volker Bauer said in an interview with German television channel ZEF, "If the US closes the door, we will open a window. And Canada is one of the few suppliers we really trust." Ottawa offered Europe long-term contracts for the supply of LNG, rare earth metals, and even recycled battery components. The Arctic Blue Corridor project, a new trade route through the port of Churchill in Manitoba that allows cargo to be delivered to Europe bypassing the east coast of the US, was particularly actively promoted. French company Total, Italian company Eni, and Norwegian company Equinor invested in the project. This step not only strengthened Canada's position as an exporter, but also showed the world that Canadian logistics could be an alternative to American transport hubs. At the same time, diplomatic ties with Asian countries were strengthened. In June, a preliminary agreement was announced with South Korea on the supply of rare earth elements for the needs of Korean microelectronics. Japan signed a memorandum of understanding on expanding access to Canadian timber and biofuels. Even Vietnam, one of the most dynamically developing markets in the region, expressed interest in building a processing complex for Canadian Rapistan soybeans in the province of Alberta.
Well, for the businesses and exporters, there is still a sense of uncertainty. They are on the edge. They don't know where they stand. So the 25% tariff for now stays, but there is also, the Trump's statement that there will be an additional penalty for India buying Russian oil and arms, and how that translates, whether it will be an additional tariff or would be that penalty would come in some other form.
But the main signal to the world was that Canada is not just expanding its exports, it is actively replacing the US in the minds of other countries as a more predictable, honest, and pragmatic partner. An example of this was Italy's sudden refusal to renew its contract for aluminum supplies from Texas. Instead, Rome signed a short-term deal with Canada's Rhino Earth Metals worth €3.2 billion. The deal was discussed in strict secrecy, but according to sources in the Italian Ministry of Industry, the reason was high political risks when working with American manufacturers. However, Canada was not only playing the trade game on the international stage. The military component became an important part of the country's new positioning. Canadian troops stationed in Latvia and Poland as part of Operation Reassurance were not just a symbol of NATO's commitment, they became a real bargaining chip in negotiations. When Carney arrived in Warsaw in July, he was accompanied by a delegation of high-ranking generals and representatives of the defense industry. The Polish Prime Minister announced that day the purchase of armored vehicles from Canada's General Force Systems for $1.1 billion. The deal was accompanied by a political message: Poland sees Canada as part of Europe's defense shield. Meanwhile, the situation in the US was heating up. Trump continued to increase tariff pressure, this time on pharmaceuticals and consumer goods. Across the country, small business owners protested as the new tariffs left them with less and less chance of survival. But the Canadian government was in no hurry to celebrate. On the contrary, analysts at the Prime Minister's office closely studied every statement made by Trump and every move made by his administration. The increase in tariffs on pharmaceutical products from the EU was particularly alarming, partly because the Canadian pharmaceutical industry is closely integrated with European component supplies. According to estimates by the University of Calgary's Centre for Trade and Innovation, more than 60% of Canadian pharmaceuticals contain European ingredients, which may now become more expensive. This meant that Canada, despite its diversification, remained vulnerable. The response was an emergency agreement with Belgium and the Netherlands to create a green corridor for pharmaceutical products, which will be protected from sharp tariff increases through subsidies and export guarantees. Against this backdrop, Canada launched an unprecedented information campaign in key capitals in Europe and Asia. Billboards appeared in Paris, Seoul, Hanoi, and Tokyo with the slogan "Canada Reliable, Resilient, Ready." The campaign was accompanied by economic forums, presentations of investment projects, and active work with local business associations. For the first time in many years, Canadian diplomats moved from a reactive mode to a proactive mode. Meanwhile, an internal crisis related to tariff policy was growing in the United States itself. A study published in August by the Yale School of Management showed that by July 2025, the average American household had already spent $2,500 more than in the same period a year ago, solely due to price increases caused by tariffs. However, Trump, speaking in Ohio, said, "We are achieving our goal. It may be painful, but it is effective. Soon, everything will come back home." He was referring to industry. But Carney and his team bet on something else, not bringing everything back home, but building a network. The strategy, called the Canada's Economic Resilience Initiative in government documents, called for expanding access to 12 new markets, creating 9 logistics hubs abroad, and revising 17 bilateral agreements. One of the most ambitious projects is a transport alliance with Japan and South Korea, which envisages the integration of Canadian ports with Asian container routes through a modernized system of Pacific hubs. This major shift from one main partner to multiple reliable ones was not just a response to tariff aggression. It became a political manifesto. Canada is no longer the little brother of the US. It is independent, confident, and ready to build a future without looking back at the impulsive decisions of its neighbors. And perhaps this is what was most unpleasant for Trump, not the rejection of tariffs, but the refusal to play by someone else's rules.